Hey guys, it's Bella. Welcome back to another Mystery Monday. I hope you guys all had the best weekend. If you're new here, welcome. We talk about true crime cases on Mondays, so if that's something that you're into, then please come and join us, come chat, and make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any future videos. Today we're going to be talking about the Hollywood Ripper, and we're going to be starting off in Glenview, Illinois, which is a quiet suburban neighborhood about 15 miles or 24 kilometers outside of Chicago. It has a population of just under 50,000, and it's known for being a family-friendly area with a strong sense of community. On the 14th of August 1993, Rick Boccaccio's morning started just like any other day. He woke up, made himself a cup of coffee, and he headed out to take the family dog for a walk. As he left the family home on Hoover Lane through the garage, he saw something that still haunts him to this day. On the steps that led into the side door of his home, he found his 18-year-old daughter, Tricia, who had been severely brutalized. He dropped his cup of coffee and he ran over to her and fell to his knees to try and help her, but he realized that it was too late. She was already gone. He started screaming for his son Doug to come and help and yelled at him repeatedly to call 911, and the police were quick to arrive on the scene. Rick was still obviously traumatized from finding his daughter's brutalized body, and he was left with the task of calling his wife Diane, who was already at work, and telling her what had happened. She recalled the phone call and said that when he called her, he said, "You have to come home, Tricia's hurt." Immediately she rushed home, and when she arrived, it was worse than any nightmare. Officers on the scene recalled her agony and said, quote, "I heard a lady screaming and the mother had just exited her vehicle and she was running towards Trish. I basically tackled her. I didn't want her to see Trish like this and remember her daughter like that." Both Rick and Diane were actually taken to the hospital and treated for shock, and at one point Diane actually blacked out. It was really confronting for the first responders, of course, but it's impossible to imagine the hurt that the Boccaccio family was going through as they came to the earth-shattering realization that their daughter and their sister had been brutally murdered. Tricia had recently graduated high school and she was just days away from beginning her studies at Purdue University, where she was set to major in genetic engineering. She wasn't the type to break the rules, she didn't drink or party, and in fact the night before she had innocently celebrated her graduation by taking part in a scavenger hunt with many of the kids from her class. Police were operating with the knowledge that she had come home in the early hours of the morning and that she had been murdered on the steps where her body had been found. Nobody who knew Tricia could make any sense of this tragedy because there was nobody that would want to hurt Tricia. It seemed like a completely senseless and untargeted attack, but the brutal and vicious way in which she was murdered suggested that there was some kind of hatred involved in the attack. Tricia really was not the kind of girl to make any enemies. Nobody that knew her could think of anybody that would want to hurt her. And her mother, Diane, said, quote, "My daughter never did anything to put herself in harm's way. She was the type of girl that you knew where she was, what she was doing, and you never had to worry about her." Tricia Lynn Boccaccio was born on the 18th of January 1975 in Evanston, Illinois, which is a neighboring suburb to Glenview. She was a beautiful, smart, and charismatic girl who attended Glenbrook South High School, where she took calculus, participated in the debate team, and played clarinet in the school band. She grew up alongside her two younger brothers, Doug and Tommy, who were 17 and 13 at the time of her death, and her mother described her in an interview as, quote, "She had a great attitude about everything and she knew what she wanted out of life." Tricia had a great relationship with both of her parents, but she was especially close with her mum, and everybody who knew the Boccaccios saw Rick and Diane to be devoted parents to all of the children. It was a really special household, and the whole neighborhood knew the Boccaccios to be a warm and loving family. It was the sort of house where children from all around the neighborhood were welcomed. There was a good chance that if you lived in the neighborhood or knew any of the kids of the Boccaccio family, that you had been to the house and you'd enjoyed Diane's delicious food. When Tricia was taken away, it left a hole not only in her family's hearts, but the whole community of Glenview, who had come to know and love her. One of Tricia's closest friends, a girl named Karen Jones, said, quote, "Tricia was an amazing girl, was probably one of the most energetic and happy people I've ever seen." Karen had been with Tricia on the night of the 13th of August. They were there alongside the majority of their senior class that they graduated with. They were having that scavenger hunt. When the scavenger hunt finished, they all went for a meal at TGI Fridays, and then they hung out in the car park for a little bit just chatting, and then Tricia drove two of her friends to their cars before driving home herself. So from this, police estimated that she got home at around 1 a.m, and as she was entering the family home is when she was ambushed. The killer twisted her arm arm and then proceeded to stab her viciously multiple times. A post-mortem examination revealed that she had been stabbed 12 times and 3 fatal stab wounds were made to her heart, her left lung, and her abdomen. Skin and blood samples from an unknown person were actually found underneath her fingernails, but because DNA testing was so new at the time, they weren't actually able to utilize it to find anything out or to figure out who those samples belonged to. And then near her body, they also found a keychain that belonged to Tricia, and they found a male footprint, but this footprint ended up belonging to her father, Rick. So as the investigation got underway, of course, police wanted to question absolutely everybody that they could. They wanted to question friends, family, classmates, her boyfriend, everybody from the neighborhood, just everybody that could have known Tricia. As it turned out, there'd been a pool party that had been taking place in the house directly across the street from the Piccaccios on the night of Tricia's murder. So of course they went and questioned a bunch of the guests from that pool party, but nobody had seen or heard anything. Some of Tricia's friends and classmates actually refused to speak to the police, which I find kind of confusing. I don't know if they were scared, maybe their parents were scared for them to talk to the police, but I don't know, I can't really understand or rationalize why you wouldn't just, if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to do with it, why wouldn't you just answer a couple of questions for the police to help find somebody that viciously murdered your friend, your classmate, or even just help find a killer that is on the loose in your area targeting your demographic? It just, I don't know, that just really didn't make any sense to me why they wouldn't talk to the police. Either way, the people that they were able to speak to, it didn't really help them come up with any leads or any suspects or anything of the sort. Nobody seemed to know anything about Tricia's murder. Nobody had any idea of anybody that would want to hurt her, no possible suspects, no possible leads, nothing, which made finding a motive for this crime almost impossible. There were no signs of sexual assault and she hadn't been robbed. Police were honestly stumped as to why somebody would want to harm Tricia, who would want to harm Tricia, and why they had done it in such a brutal manner when it seemed like such an untargeted crime. With no strong evidence and no promising leads, there was really nothing that this investigation had to go off, and so it was becoming really frustrating for the Piccaccio family and also for investigators who really wanted to hold somebody accountable for this crime. The Piccaccio family was so stricken with grief over what had happened that they actually moved out of the family home where this horrendous crime had happened and moved in with Diane's family, and their beloved home where they had built a life together as a family sat empty. They just couldn't bear to live there without Tricia, but there were so many special memories in that home for the family because they had, like I said, they'd built their life there. And so occasionally Rick would return to the house to maintain the garden. Over the next 4 years, the house remained vacant, and Diane went and she met with detectives multiple times a week to just try and encourage them and motivate them to continue working on their daughter's case and continue trying to find their daughter's killer, because effectively at this point, the case had gone dormant. There was no new leads, there was just nothing popping up, and not through a lack of trying, there just was nothing. There was no evidence, there was no leads, there were no suspects. No one had any idea who would want to harm Tricia. Diane and Rick never gave up, and in 1997, through their determination, a new investigative team was actually assigned to the case, and they started looking into the case with a fresh set of eyes. The Piccaccios told the detectives as well about this local boy who, since Tricia's murder, had just been acting in a really bizarre way towards them. This kid's name was Michael Thomas Gargiulo, and he was pretty well known to the Piccaccios because he lived just 5 doors down from them, and he was friends with their son, Tricia's younger brother, Doug. And he was just always hanging around in the neighborhood with all the neighborhood kids, so obviously he was over their house a couple of times as well. So he was born on the 15th of February 1976, and he grew up alongside 6 siblings in Glenview, Illinois. He was known to be a bit of a hothead around the neighborhood, and a former friend actually described him saying, quote, "This guy would go from normal to crazy in like a second. The switch would flip and he would just become almost inhuman." He attended Glenbrook South High School alongside Tricia and Doug Piccaccio, and during his time there, he was reportedly involved in a battery incident, and he was also allegedly caught breaking into unlocked cars, for which he was sentenced to 18 months probation and made to pay a small fine. Some sources online describe him as being the black sheep of his family, and his family, like by all accounts, were lovely people. Those who knew him from his adolescence repeatedly described him as angry, violent, and easily irritable. Despite this though, the Piccaccio family, they were very loving people. They always saw the best in people, and they were so warm and welcoming to everybody, all of the kids in the neighborhood, their kids' friends. And so on multiple occasions, they allowed Michael into their home, and they allowed Doug to go over to the Gargiulo's home as well. Diane actually recalled an incident where she went over to their home to pick Doug up, and apparently Michael's parents were telling her how they were afraid of him. According to Diane, they actually said to her, quote, "We would like to kick him out of the house, but we're afraid that he will come back and kill us." Diane also recalled his dad saying, quote, "He probably needs medicine, but he won't take it." In the years after Tricia's murder, the entire family actually up and left the home and left Michael there by himself, alone in the house. So safe to say, they had a bit of a complicated relationship. And by all accounts as well, his family was said to be lovely. Like the Gargiulo family were well liked, well respected. And so the fact that they left him there by himself in that home, they all moved away and kind of like abandoned him, I guess, I think it says probably a lot about him and how they felt about him. So his strange behavior towards the Piccaccios started after Tricia's death. He brought Diane some flowers, which alone, if it was an isolated incident, wouldn't be strange, but it wasn't an isolated incident. He just kept rocking up at their house with these different gifts. First, he brought a gift card to a restaurant, and then he brought a t-shirt for Rick. And Rick and Diane just thought this was really weird because it's just like this random kid from the neighborhood who keeps coming and bringing them these random gifts, like a restaurant gift card, a t-shirt, flowers. Like he just kept rocking up with gifts for them, and nobody else in the neighborhood was doing it, just Michael. And he had no explanation for why he was doing it either. They obviously passed this information on to the detectives, who they had previously actually questioned Michael at the start of the investigation because, you know, they questioned everybody who knew Tricia, neighborhood kids, classmates, friends, family, everybody. So they just kind of asked him some questions in passing the way they did with everybody else. But now, after hearing this information and the fact that he was just kind of acting a little bit out of the ordinary, and he seemed to be the only person acting a little bit out of the ordinary, they started to take a little bit of a closer look at him. Obviously, they wanted to go and speak to him again as well. When they questioned him, he claimed to them that apparently the morning after Tricia's murder, one of his friends, a guy named Gargiulo, had come to him with a gym bag and wanted him to dispose of or hide of this gym bag. And he strongly implied that this bag contained the murder weapon. Eric obviously becomes a suspect at this point, but he refused to speak to police. Police couldn't find any evidence against Eric. They couldn't find any evidence of this gym bag being a thing, the murder weapon, anything against Michael. They just couldn't find any evidence, period. And so once again, the case started to go cold. Then eventually the Piccaccios moved back into their Hoover Lane house. And after they did, they get an impromptu visit from none other than Michael Gargiulo. So he came by the house wanting to talk to Rick about something, but Rick was at work, Diane was home alone, and he decided to sit and wait in their living room for Rick to get home from work, which was over an hour, which is so strange because, dude, you live 5 houses down the street. Like, just go home. Go home and come back in an hour. Then when Rick finally gets home, Michael, before he can even talk to him about whatever he just sat in his living room for an hour waiting to tell him, all of a sudden Michael's dad and one of his sisters comes to the house, grabs him and whisks him away, saying that they had to go. So Michael was never actually able to talk to Rick about what he wanted to talk to him about, and it seemed like Michael's parents or Michael's family actually intervened in order to prevent him from saying whatever it was that he was going to say. When Rick recounted this interaction years later, he said that the look on Michael's face indicated to him that Michael knew something about Tricia's murder. And from this point on, both Rick and Diane believed that Michael was somehow involved in their daughter's murder. He was just acting too weird on too many occasions. They obviously went and informed detectives, but by the time detectives went to question him, he had left Illinois. He eventually moved to Los Angeles to pursue a career in acting and modeling, and his girlfriend from Illinois, named Allison, ended up following him to LA as well to be with him. While he was living there, he worked as a bouncer at a place called the Rainbow Bar and Grill, which has a restaurant and a bar downstairs, and then upstairs it's a nightclub called Over the Rainbow. He was allegedly fired from this job for hitting a customer, after which he began working as an air conditioning repairman. And those that knew him from his time in California describe him as a bit of a ladies' man, actually. Many people describe him as a good-looking guy who had no trouble picking up women. During the fall of 2000, he met a woman named Ashley Ellerin on a chance encounter. Ashley had moved to LA the year earlier, and she was a part-time fashion student who lived in a bungalow in the Hollywood Hills on Pinehurst Road. She was really living the 2000s LA dream. She was this like socialite. She was a beautiful girl. She drove a convertible BMW. She was hanging out with celebrities on the regular, going to VIP parties. And one day outside the Pinehurst Road property, her friend Christopher Duran was changing a flat tire when along comes Michael Gargiulo. He just happened to be walking by, he saw Chris changing the tire, and he went up to offer him some help, which Chris declined. According to Chris, Ashley comes out while this is going on, and Michael just immediately diverts his attention to her, and they start flirting, they start chatting, and eventually they exchange numbers, with Michael giving her his business card from the air conditioning repair company that he worked for. After this interaction, Michael just starts calling her all the time. He even shows up to her house uninvited, offering to fix her heating system. He would call the house and her roommates would answer, and apparently was just becoming very stalkerish because Ashley really barely even knew this guy. And it also seemed like Ashley herself was actually quite popular with the men, not just Michael, but it seemed like there were quite a few men that wanted to get to know her, take her out, including celebrities like Vin Diesel, Vince Vaughn, and even Ashton Kutcher, who at the time was gaining a lot of popularity for his role on That 70s Show. So they were actually set to go on a date on the evening of the 21st of February 2001. So they had met about 2 months earlier, and they weren't dating or anything. They just kind of seen each other around here and there. And he had actually been to her house just the week before their February 21st date because there was a party at her house. They organized to go out for drinks on that Wednesday, the 21st. But when the date came around, he was late, super late. So they spoke that afternoon at around 3 to 4 p.m. when Ashton finished rehearsals. Then he contacted her again at around 7:30 p.m. and then again at 8:30 p.m., at which point she said that she had just gotten out of the shower, and he told her that he was going to be late because he had decided to go around to a friend's house to watch the Grammys, which I'm sorry, but that is crazy work. If you have a date on, when the Grammys are going to be. Everybody knows when the Grammys are going to be, especially as an actor. So it's just crazy work to organize a date for that night and then say, you know what, actually, I'm going to go to my friend's house and watch the Grammys until 10:45 p.m. 10:45 p.m. This man did not show up at her house until 10:45 p.m. He did try to call her 4 times between 8:30 and 10:45, but she never answered him. And he kind of just chalked this up to bad phone reception. So when he finally got to her house, he went up to the door, he knocked, but he got no answer. He noticed that her car was still in the driveway and that all of the lights were on. So he tried to knock a couple more times, he even tried to open the front door, but nothing, no answer. Eventually, obviously, he leaves because he's under the assumption that she's already gone out for the night and she was probably upset that he was so late for their date. The next morning at around 8:30 a.m., 22-year-old Ashley Ellerin's dead body was discovered by her roommate, Jennifer. When Jennifer entered the house, she had found Ashley laying in a large pool of blood, and as she approached her friend's body, she noticed that she was blue in the face. Immediately, she contacted the police, and first responders said that it was one of the most gruesome scenes that they had ever walked into. When her father found out, he was completely blindsided because he had actually been with her the day of her murder. The day before she was found, he had been visiting her, helping her with just some renovations of the house that she was living in, minor bits and bobs like painting, that sort of thing. And she had dropped him off at the airport at 5:50 p.m. So just hours before, she was viciously murdered. The scene of the crime was brutal. There was blood everywhere. She was covered in blood after being stabbed a total of 47 times, with lacerations to her neck so severe that she had almost been decapitated. There were severe wounds to her chest, her abdomen, and her back, and according to the medical examiner, 12 of these wounds were severe enough to have been fatal. According to one of the detectives who had been at the scene as well, she had been stabbed in the back of the head so hard that it had actually taken out a chunk of her skull. She was found wearing a turquoise bathrobe and silk undergarments, and she was found just outside of the bathroom on a carpeted landing. Her curling iron was found on the floor near her, and her hairdryer was still sitting on the toilet seat, so it was clear that she had been attacked in the middle of just attempting to get ready for the night. Her roommate Jennifer had actually shown up at the house at about 10:15, so about 30 minutes before Ashton Kutcher showed up at the property. She had knocked on the door trying to get in because she'd left her keys at a friend's house, but Ashley never answered the door, so it's likely that she had already been murdered by this time. The bungalow where Ashley lived on Pinehurst Road had 2 sets of gates, one down at the street and then one further up at the actual house. The doors had been locked, the windows had bars, and there were no signs of forced entry, so police were of the belief that whoever was responsible for this crime knew Ashley and that she had let them into the house. Her body had also fallen in kind of an odd way and in an odd position. So her legs were slightly apart, and then one of her legs was kind of bent in a bit of an awkward position. And this led investigators to believe that the killer had actually moved her body. Now, the issue with this crime scene is that there was literally no evidence. The only evidence that they had was that they knew that there was no signs of forced entry, so probably she knew her killer. They knew that potentially he had moved her body. And then there was also an Adidas footprint that had been leading away from Ashley's body. And this really, they couldn't even do anything with that, because unless they can figure out exactly which make of Adidas shoe it is, and then exactly who purchased that Adidas shoe, I mean, that's impossible, you know what I mean? So they really can't do anything with that shoe print. And that was all of the evidence that they had, so they pretty much had nothing. Detective Tom Small, who was the lead investigator on this case, said, quote, "The killer was a modern-day Jack the Ripper, vicious and very personal. He wanted to inflict as many wounds as he could. I knew in my mind that the person who did this was a serial killer, that he had done this before and he had gotten away with it." So while detectives continued to thoroughly search for evidence in the interior and the exterior of the property, they also sent multiple teams out to search and question and canvass every single house in the surrounding area. Ashley's murder was an exceptionally confusing case for detectives, just because the amount of stab wounds and the amount of hatred needed to conduct such a vicious crime indicated a crime of passion, but there was no obvious motive. Ashley had no known enemies, there was nothing that had been stolen, and there was no evidence of a sexual attack. So investigators got to work questioning everybody that knew Ashley. She had quite a large social circle, and one of the people they questioned was, of course, Ashton Kutcher. He actually went to the police himself after he heard about Ashley's murder because he thought that he could potentially be a suspect, having organized a date with her for the night of her murder. He told detectives that he had last spoken with her at 8:30 p.m, which is when she told him she had just gotten out of the shower, and then he showed up at her house at around 10:45 p.m. There was no answer from her, and because she wasn't answering the door, he did try to open the front door. He also looked in the windows, and when he looked in the window, he saw a large red stain on the carpet, which he just assumed was spilled red wine. He also noted to detectives that when he did look in the window, it did look a little bit messy, but he didn't really think too much of it because he knew that they had just moved in and they were performing renovations. So he was ruled out as a suspect very quickly, and police continued to question people in her social circle, and they uncovered the fact that she was actually having a secret affair with her property manager, a man named Mark Durbin, and they had actually seen each other on the night of her murder as well. Police obviously went and questioned him. Again, he was very forthcoming with police, and so he was very quickly ruled out as a suspect as well. Like I said earlier, Ashley had a lot of friends, so police were, making their way through the list, questioning all of them. And really what they found out through this time is that she really was not the type of person to make enemies. She was always considered the life of the party. She was easygoing, she was friendly, and she was described as somebody that everybody wanted to know and wanted to be friends with. Nobody could think of a single person that would want to harm her, and especially not in such a vicious and brutal way. There was one thing that kept popping up in these interviews that Detective Small conducted. Dozens of times in these interviews, a man named Mike was mentioned. People only knew him as Mike. Nobody knew his full name. They just knew that his name was Mike and that he was an air conditioning repairman. Multiple people that were close with Ashley mentioned this guy to police and said that he, behaved in a really odd way and that they were wary of him. When Ashley's friend Chris Duran initially spoke with police, he claimed that he told them about an air conditioning and heating repairman whose name he couldn't recall. He said that they did write this down when he told them, but they weren't initially too concerned about his involvement. Her roommates even recalled an incident. I'm not sure if they told this to police or not. I'm sure they did. Otherwise, how would we know it? But her roommates recalled an incident where they had a party and this Mike guy just shows up to the party and he just sits on the couch and stares at Ashley for the whole night. Like the whole time he's there. On another occasion, one of her other roommates, a guy named Justin Peterson, also said that he noticed Mike sitting outside their apartment in his car at 3 a.m. The next day, he comes around to their house to fix the heater, and Justin confronts him about seeing him sitting out of their house at 3 a.m. And he said, quote, he started to go on about the fact that he couldn't go home last night because the FBI was waiting for him at his home to collect DNA samples from Chicago. Some case or some murder, his best friend's girlfriend was murdered or whatever. And I said, well, what do you have to hide? And he immediately put his leg up on the couch and started to pull out a knife that was strapped to his ankle. At that point, I rushed him out of the house. For obvious reasons, her roommates really were not a fan of this guy, and they warned Ashley about him and warned Ashley about his strange behavior, but she was really the type of person to just see the best in everybody, so she wasn't too worried about him at the time. Now, obviously, nobody knows this guy is anything but Mike, so he wasn't really friends with Ashley, didn't know her, like he barely knew her, he didn't know any of her friends, and so it took months for the authorities to actually uncover his full name. They really didn't have anything to go off except the fact that his name was Mike, he was a heating and air conditioning repairman, and the stories that people told them about this mysterious Mike. They learned that Mike had been telling people a story about how he had been hit by a cement truck outside the Kodak Theatre during its construction, and so he was suing the construction company and was set to receive a large payout from that. So Detective Small then decides to go through all of the traffic incidents that had happened near the theatre, and he doesn't find anything about a person being hit by a car there, but he finds an incident of a dog being hit by a car there, and that incident was reported by none other than Michael Gargiulo. So while all of this was going on in California, the investigation into Tricia Piccaccio's death back in Illinois was starting to gain some momentum. By 2002, Lou Sala, who was a member of the Cook County Sheriff's Cold Case Division, had begun working on the case, had been assigned to the case. And with new technology, he wanted to create a DNA profile of Tricia's killer. He and his team combed through all of the evidence that had been collected originally in the 1993 investigation of the crime scene, and from this, they took the DNA that was found underneath Tricia's fingernails and they started this massive campaign to try and identify who this DNA belonged to. They looked at every single person they could think of, every person that you could imagine, friends, family, classmates, people in the neighborhood, of course, most of whom were more than happy to help, more than happy to provide their DNA to be ruled out. One of the people on this big list of people they were going through was, of course, Michael Gargiulo. Of course, by this point, he's living in LA. The police, the county sheriffs know that, and so they reach out to the LAPD in order to get them to assist with getting his DNA sample. And this is kind of where the cogs start turning and the police start kind of connecting these two cases, because they have two very similar cases in that they were very, very vicious, very brutal, and they have this same guy who is loosely connected to both of them. The LAPD were able to retrieve a DNA sample from him after they tracked him down, they issued a search warrant, and they also searched his van. And inside his van, they found 3 knives, binoculars, and then also a backpack. And inside this backpack, they found a Halloween mask and a handgun. Michael also really was not cooperative about giving his DNA at all. They actually had to apprehend him, take him to a medical center, and at this medical center, there was some sort of altercation that ended up in him being taken to the emergency room. During this altercation, he allegedly asked, "What if my DNA was found on a keychain left at the scene?" He also allegedly asked, "They can't find my DNA from 10 years ago at a crime scene, can they?" As it turns out, they could, and they did. When his DNA was sent back to Illinois for examination, it confirmed that the DNA found underneath Tricia Piccaccio's fingernails was a match to Michael Gargiulo. Now, you might be thinking, this is pretty solid evidence, right? This is exactly what they needed to prove that Michael Gargiulo killed Tricia Piccaccio. How else would his DNA be underneath her fingernails? You might be thinking that's enough to charge and arrest him for the murder, but you would actually be wrong. The state's attorney's office in Illinois wanted more. They claimed that this DNA evidence was not enough to prove that he was the murderer because he was known to the family. They didn't want to press charges and go to trial only for his defense to say, well, how can you prove that just because his DNA was there means he murdered her? He was a friend of the family. It could have got there in a perfectly innocent way when he was hanging out with the Picaccios. He had actually crossed paths with her the day before her murder, so he had been driving with a friend named Scott Olson, and as they were driving, they noticed Tricia walking on the footpath. As they passed her, they noticed that she was crying, so they stopped, they asked her what was wrong, and because she knew that they were friends of her brother Doug, she asked them if they could have a lift, and they dropped her home, and then they parted ways. This story was also corroborated by Scott Olson, and the fact that Michael had seen Tricia the day before her murder in such an innocent way that that story was corroborated, that he was a friend of the family, meant that building a case against him would be very difficult. They were of the belief that there was just too much of a chance that his DNA had gotten underneath her fingernails in a perfectly innocent way because he knew the family, he knew Tricia, he'd seen her the day before she was murdered, which I know how that DNA got there. You know how that DNA got there. The police know how that DNA got there, but I guess they didn't think they could prove it. I mean, how does someone's DNA get under somebody else's fingernails innocently, especially when he's not her friend? It's not like she's going up and scratching him, or nobody else's DNA was found under there. Like, under that reasoning, why didn't they find her dad's DNA under there? Why didn't they find her brother's DNA under there? Why didn't they find her mum's DNA under there? Like, it's his DNA. But I guess they just, I don't know, they claimed, I guess, that a defense attorney could use the fact that he knew the family to paint reasonable doubt. And so for that reason, they wanted further corroborating evidence that directly tied him to the murder. The fact that the state attorney wasn't going to be prosecuting him despite this DNA evidence was obviously devastating for the Piccaccio family, and Tricia's mum Diane said, quote, "I don't know why they didn't arrest him. They claim there wasn't enough evidence. I said, who else's DNA was on her? For some reason they must have a low opinion of a jury here in Chicago. Who wouldn't convict someone from DNA?" So despite what seems logical, despite the fact that, it's pretty clear that he is Tricia's murderer, there was nothing that law enforcement could do in Illinois. They weren't allowed to prosecute because the state attorney had made that decision. And then because there wasn't any DNA in Ashley's case in California, they couldn't prosecute him there either. And so Michael Gargiulo was still a free man. Now, like I said, he was known to be a real ladies' man, and while he was dating Allison, while he was in LA, Allison, who moved from Illinois to LA to be with him, he was actually cheating on her with a woman named Velma Carrillo. She was a McDonald's cashier. They had met in an online chat room, and they actually went on to have a child together. And then while he's dating both Allison and Velma at the same time, he is also cheating on both of them, dating another woman who's a doctor. Honestly, it's hard to keep track of all of the women that he was dating because he was like jumping from woman to not even jumping. He was just collecting women like Pokemon and living with various different women at the same time. When Detective Small, the detective on Ashley Ellerin's case, found Michael, you remember when he was looking into this like mysterious Mike and then he uncovered it was Michael Gargiulo? When he discovered that it was Michael Gargiulo and he found him, he actually found that he was dating another woman, living with her in West Hollywood. In February 2003, he started dating another woman named Maria Garola, and she actually allowed him to move in with her and her 4 children. They broke up very shortly after because Michael punched her. She ends up filing a restraining order against him, saying that he threatened to kill her and said that he would get away with it because of his extensive knowledge on forensics. Each of the women that he dated over the years all have their own stories of his lies and his abusive antics. And honestly, after reading about all of them, it was clear that he was a compulsive liar and he would use his lies to seduce all of these different women. He told one woman that he studied forensics and that he had come to California to train for the Olympics as a boxer. And then of course there's also the cement truck story that he told Ashley and her friends. He just had this habit of telling these stories that were made up but had tiny little slivers of truth in them in order to make himself seem impressive, when in reality he was definitely not an impressive man. It's also alleged that apparently he told multiple people that he had left Chicago because the police there were trying to frame him for a murder that he didn't commit. So by September 2005, he'd left Hollywood and he was now living in the neighboring suburb of El Monte, where he had started his own air conditioning business. At this point, he was living with a woman named Grace Quack, who he had met on Match.com, and she was also pregnant with his child at this point too. But just like all of his apartments, it wasn't long before this relationship also turned sour, and after becoming sick of his abuse over the Thanksgiving weekend of 2005, she moved out of their Arden Way apartment that they shared. There was something seriously wrong with this guy. I mean, obviously there was something seriously wrong with this guy, but it's just insane that he was able to woo all of these different women and convince all of these women that he's like this great, successful guy, when in reality, he's like a deadbeat piece of shit. So shortly after Grace and Michael's separation, a woman named Maria Bruno moved into his apartment block in Arden Way. On the 1st of December, about 10 days after she moved in, the 32-year-old mother of 4 was murdered. Her ex-husband, Irving Bruno, was the one who discovered her in a pool of her own blood. She had been stabbed 17 times, her throat had been slashed, both of her breasts had been cut off and the implants had been removed, and disturbingly, her nipple had been placed back in her mouth. Outside of her apartment, they found a disposable blue shoe covering which had her blood on it, and it also had DNA in it that couldn't be matched. A screen had been pried loose from her kitchen window, and there was also a block of knives that was still in their packaging, but the butcher's knife had been removed and it was nowhere to be found. Mark Lilienfeld was one of the detectives who responded to the crime scene, and he said, quote, "I've been a homicide detective 17 years, and this was one of the most gruesome crime scenes I've ever seen." As police began their inquiries, they found that Maria had actually just left a domestic violence situation involving her ex-husband Irving, who at the time of her death had custody of their children. Despite their rocky past, Maria and Irving were actually on pretty good terms. They still worked together, and when he discovered her body, he had actually shown up at her apartment to take her to work. He was obviously interviewed, and when police did question him, they found that he and Maria had dinner together the night before her murder, and they had decided to give things another go between the two of them. Maria had a couple of drinks at this dinner, and so she left her car at Irving's and he drove her home and got her home at about 1:30 a.m. During a search of Irving's car, they actually found traces of Maria's blood in the car as well as on his baseball cap, which he told detectives it had been there, or it may have been there, because at dinner she had cut her finger, and that story of her cutting her finger was actually backed up by the manager of the restaurant that they ate at. All of Irving's movements were, and everything that he said was caught on CCTV. All of his story was backed up by CCTV, and so for that reason, he was cleared as a suspect. So detectives, the next thing that they did was they checked everybody who lived in the building, and nobody that lived in the building had a disturbing police record. There was no arrest records that kind of rang any alarm bells of any of the occupants. Despite this, obviously, they went and they wanted to canvass the building. They went knocking on every single door of every single apartment in the building. And of course, they knocked at one point on the building, on the door of Michael Gargiulo, but he wasn't home. They placed a card under his door, but he never responded. One of the neighbors that lived in the apartment building, a guy named Robert Rasmussen, said that in the days leading up to Maria's murder, he noticed a man in a hoodie and a baseball cap sort of playing around with and tampering with her doorknob and also peering through her window. On another occasion, he noticed this same man following her to her apartment when she was bringing groceries in, and he said, quote, "She went into the apartment and he followed her in. The minute she stepped over the threshold, he backed out and the door was shut." What's really sad about this situation as well is Maria had actually chosen this apartment complex because it had decent security. It was a gated complex, and to get inside you either had to use a key or a code. So it's not like any random off the street could come in. It was clear that this person who was stalking her had to live in this apartment complex. But nothing ever came of the investigation. In fact, investigators never even questioned Michael Gargiulo. And the mystery man that was seen by neighbors practically stalking her was never identified by the police. So eventually Michael moved away from El Monte, and in 2007 he began working for a company called Gus the Plumber. He was still dating a lot of women. By 2008 he had moved to Santa Monica and he was dating a woman named Ana Luz Gonzalez. They had met at a plumbing showroom, and by the time Michael moved to Santa Monica they had actually already gotten married, so he moved into Santa Monica with her and her mum on Euclid Avenue. On the 28th of April of that same year that Michael moved to Santa Monica, 26-year-old Michelle Murphy was attacked in her sleep just before midnight in her apartment in Santa Monica. She woke up to a man on top of her, plunging a knife into her chest. He'd broken into the apartment complex through an open window, gained access to Michelle's apartment, and he had left the front door open for an easy escape. The attacker snuck into her bedroom and straddled her as he attempted to kill Michelle. There was a violent struggle in which Michelle received several cuts and several puncture wounds to her upper body and cuts to her hands. But despite being much smaller than her attacker, she was able to kick him off her, which forced him to flee. Michelle chased this hooded man out of her bedroom and down the hallway, and she later told police that he was yelling out to her, "I'm sorry," as he was fleeing the scene. Once he was gone, the first thing that she did was call her boyfriend, who contacted 911.
She told me that she woke up and there was someone on top of her and she forced them off and they ran out.
As the police were on their way, they also called Michelle to try and get a description of her attacker so that they could try and hunt him down.
The fire department is already on the way and we're on our way. What does this person look like?
He definitely asked me after like a long sleeve, like chester kind of thing. Everything's just dark.
You don't know how big this guy was? How tall he was?
Maybe almost, I don't know, like 5'11" or something.
When the police arrived at her apartment, they found that there was actually a trail of blood leading from Michelle's apartment into the alleyway because the attacker had cut himself during the struggle. Police obviously collected samples of this blood and they sent it off for analysis, and when the results came back almost a month later, they found that the blood was a match to Michael Gargiulo. On the 6th of June 2008, within 24 hours of these results coming back, Michael Gargiulo was arrested and charged with the attempted murder of Michelle Murphy. After he was arrested, Michelle finally saw what he looked like, and she told police that she actually had seen him before. While she was working out, he had passed her and he had come and tried to speak to her. As it turns out, at the time of the attack, Michael lived almost directly opposite Michelle and would have even been able to see into her bedroom if he wanted to. Sergeant Rich Lewis from the Santa Monica PD realized that Michael had left DNA at both the attack of Michelle Murphy as well as the scene of the murder of Tricia Boccaccio. He also recalled a conversation he had with Detective Lilienfeld, who was working on Maria Bruno's case from 2005. And it was kind of like this light bulb moment he had that these cases were all connected. The crimes were so similar in not only their brutality, but also the fact that in the way that Michael lived directly across from Michelle Murphy, he also lived almost directly across from Maria Bruno at the time of her murder. So police go back and they search Michael's apartment that he had been living in at the time of Maria's murder, and in the attic of his apartment, they found a blue surgical shoe covering, which was exactly the same make, model, and manufacturer as the one that was found outside of Maria's apartment complex after her murder with her blood on it. So they analyzed the one found in his attic for DNA, and of course, his DNA was found on that shoe covering. So now he's been connected by DNA to 2 murders and 1 attempted murder. In the case of Ashley Ellerin, there was no DNA evidence in that case whatsoever, but the manner of attack was so similar to these other 3 attacks in which they had already linked Michael through his DNA that investigators believed that he was responsible for all 4 crimes. And not only were they similar in the manner of attack, but he also lived very close to all 4 women. He lived close to Michelle, he lived close to Maria, he lived close to Tricia, and he also lived just a few hundred feet away from Ashley at the time of her murder. So at this point, everything is starting to kind of come together. All of these cases are coming together. And about a month after his arrest for the attempted murder of Michelle Murphy, he was charged with the murders of Maria Bruno and Ashley Ellerin. Michael Gargiulo was held in jail without bond, and just 10 days after he was arrested, he was captured on camera trying to unlock his handcuffs with a piece of a plastic spoon. He allegedly also talked about, quote, disabling the jailer with a fatal throat punch, according to the LA County Sheriff's Detective Michael Stalley. The same detective said that Michael also talked about various other tactics he would use to escape, including the popping out of a window and hopping a fence. Whether he was being serious or just trying to sound tough to the other inmates, I don't know, but he never actually escaped and instead received an extra charge for attempted escape. While being held in jail, Michael went through a whole bunch of different attorneys before finally settling on one named Daniel Nardoni. And then on the 21st of June 2008, during a 2-week preliminary hearing, it was decided that evidence of Tricia Boccaccio's murder was going to actually be allowed in his trial, despite the fact that he hadn't been charged with her murder. Despite justice, looking like it was going to happen in California, he's being tried for these 2 murders, this attempted murder. It looked like it was going to be a long road before the Piccaccio family would actually see justice for their daughter. They were still pushing to have him charged with her murder in Illinois, but despite the fact that there was DNA evidence linking him to her murder, the Cook County prosecutor at the time, a guy named Scott Cassidy, refused to prosecute Michael for the crime. And despite how incredibly frustrating this would have been, Tricia's family never gave up, and finally, in 2011, they had a breakthrough. The security guards that worked with Michael at the Rainbow Bar and Grill saw a 48 Hours episode detailing Michael's crimes, and they decided to come forward with information that they had. So these 2 guys are Tim Ellerin and Anthony DiLorenzo, and they claimed that back in 2000, Michael had actually admitted to them that he had killed Tricia Piccaccio. The 2 of them claimed that they really didn't believe that he was serious at the time, but then they saw that 48 Hours report about his crimes and about Tricia's murder, and it kind of all clicked for them. So when they finally got in touch with the authorities in Illinois with this information that they had, charges were finally filed against Michael Gargiulo for the murder of Tricia Piccaccio 18 years after her death. Back in California, Michael Gargiulo's trial began on the 2nd of May, 2019. Nearly 30 years after his first alleged murder, the accused serial killer, now dubbed the Hollywood Ripper, was standing trial for the first-degree murders of Ashley Ellerin and Maria Bruno, as well as the first-degree attempted murder of Michelle Murphy. The prosecution were allowed to provide evidence from his alleged murder of Tricia Piccaccio, although her parents were going to have to wait for him to be extradited there after the completion of this trial. The prosecution began with the attempted murder of Michelle Murphy, allowing her to give her own testimony, which was both incredibly shocking and heartbreaking for the court to hear. It is astounding how close this woman was to death, and she still managed to summon the strength to fight him off and chase him down into an alleyway. And her doing this was able to connect him to all of these previous crimes that he had committed but hadn't been found for. In Michelle's words, she said, quote, "I was fighting with everything I had. In the days, weeks, and months after it happened, I barely even slept. I feared the nighttime and going to bed. I still slept with the lights on for a long time." In Michelle's case, they had strong DNA evidence against him, but in the cases against Ashley Ellerin and Maria Bruno, the evidence wasn't quite as strong. So the prosecution also used evidence of him stalking his victims, living near his victims, watching them, and even befriending them before he would strike at night, and he would attack them and stab them so viciously. And the prosecution described and said that he was getting sexual gratification from doing so. They also argued that the blood spatter on the scenes, at the scenes of both crimes, indicated that the attacker was left-handed, which Michael was. This allegation was also corroborated by Michelle Murphy, who said that although it was dark so she couldn't quite see her attacker during the attack, she was certain that the attacker was left-handed. They also presented the connection in Maria Bruno's murder of the blue surgical shoe covering, the one that was found at the scene of her crime with her blood on it, and then one that was found in his previous apartment, in the attic of his previous apartment, which had his DNA on them, and they were exactly the same make, model, same manufacturer, everything. The prosecution also alleged that Michael had studied something called the Anarchist Cookbook, which is basically like an encyclopedia of a bunch of illegal stuff. It has information in it about how to make explosive drugs, and most damning for Michael, it had detailed descriptions of the most effective ways to kill somebody with a knife. The book allegedly detailed how to hold a knife, as well as where to stab somebody with a knife to kill them, and these details were extremely similar to the way in which these women were murdered. Those close to Michael also testified and said that he had an obsession with Ted Bundy and also with forensic analysis in general. His former best friend, Mirko Hoffman, testified and said, quote, "He read up on it and he did a lot of research online. He said that if he ever committed a crime, he would get away with it." According to Mirko, Michael was also a big fan of America's Most Wanted because he, quote, "would learn lessons from other criminals that got caught." The defense tried to discredit Mirko, saying that he and Michael had fallen out, and they also, during cross-examination, noted that he had named Michael as a suspect when his $5,000 rifle got stolen in 2003. Ashton Kutcher was also called to give testimony at the trial and was crucial to outlining the timeline of Ashley Ellerin's murder. When asked about the night of February 21st, 2001, the evening of Ashley's murder, he told the court that he and Ashley had planned to go out that night, that he last spoke to her at 8:24 p.m, and that he last called her at 10:15 p.m, but got no answer. He claimed that he arrived at her house at around 10:45 p.m, knocked at the door, got no answer, and so when he peered in her window, that's when he saw that red stain that he, at the time, thought was red wine. This testimony highlighted a timeline of about 2 hours in which Ashley could have been murdered. He continued, saying that after Ashley's murder, he, quote, went to the police, I was like, my fingerprints are on this door, like I was freaking out. The media obviously went absolutely ballistic at the fact that a celebrity was included in this trial, gave testimony at this trial, and unfortunately the way that the media handled this, I think it was a real shame because the media focused so much on Ashton Kutcher that it really overshadowed the victims and their families and their stories. Honestly, before I looked into this case, the only way that I had heard of this case and the only thing I even knew about this case is that Ashton Kutcher had given testimony for the trial of this case. And that's because of the way the media used that and portrayed that. Testimony was also heard from a woman named Yadira Reyes. She told the court that she'd met Michael when she was 26, and her photo had actually been shown on the news because police were appealing for information to determine whether or not she was a potential victim. And so one of her family members contacted her and urged her to contact the police. She testified that while the two of them were on a date, Michael had actually forced her into the back of his work van and raped her. She claims that she pleaded with him to stop, and eventually he did, but not before threatening her, telling her that he had memorized her work schedule and he would kill her and her family if she ever said anything. And honestly, her testimony kind of brings into question how many other potential victims of his are out there that we don't know about. Tricia Picacchio's case was also really important to this trial because Michael, again, like with all his other victims, he lived close to her, and the way that this crime happened and the details of this crime really highlighted the similarities between all four cases. And not only were all four cases similar, so they were linked in that way, but his DNA was under Tricia's fingernails. And so he was linked to her through DNA. He was linked to Michelle's case through DNA. And he was linked to all four cases through the similarities between them. The two security guards from the Rainbow Bar and Grill, Tim Ellerin and Anthony DiLorenzo, were also called to the stand in Michael's Californian trial. They were asked to identify him, which they did, and they also testified to what was effectively an admission of guilt by Michael. The Picacchio family was also given the opportunity to speak at this trial, and they did. They all gave their individual or testified to their own individual relationships with Michael. Michael Gargiulo has always maintained his innocence despite literally leaving DNA at the scenes of two of these crimes. His defense attorney focused heavily on the case of Ashley Ellerin because that was the case with the smallest amount of DNA evidence. There really was no physical evidence in that case at all. And so the defense really tried to hone in on that, and they also tried to provide another potential suspect to paint reasonable doubt, and that was Mark Durbin, the property manager that Ashley had been having an affair with. They tried to say that he was actually the killer. This theory hinged greatly on the timeline that was provided by Ashton Kutcher because he said that he spoke to her at 8:24 p.m. and she had said that she'd just gotten out of the shower. Mark had claimed that he was with Ashley when she had that shower. And there was another neighbor who testified that she had heard a woman scream at around 8:20 or 8:30 p.m. And she had heard those screams coming from Ashley's house. Mark had no motive to want to kill Ashley. And on top of this, who is more likely to have murdered her? This guy, Mark, with no criminal history, or this murderer? The murderer who was acting really creepy toward her, calling her, showing up at her house in the lead up to her murder. His defense also took the same approach with the murder of Maria Bruno. They tried to paint the ex-husband, Irving, as the murderer because obviously they had a history of domestic abuse. Her blood was also found in his car and on his baseball cap, both of which were explained away, and CCTV confirmed his story of how that blood got in there. Obviously, she cut her finger at dinner and that's how the blood got there, and that was seen on CCTV, and the manager of the restaurant they ate at confirm that story as well. The defense also called a neighbor to testify, and they testified that they heard crying coming from Maria's apartment at around 1:30 a.m. And as we know, 1:30 a.m. is around the time that Irving dropped Maria home after dinner. According to Irving, though, the two of them were intimate after he dropped her home, and this could potentially explain away the sounds of the crying. The defense also tried to argue, and this is crazy, but they tried to argue that the surgical shoe covering that was found with Maria's blood on it had fallen out of Michael's pocket on his way home from work, and it had conveniently fallen into Maria's blood. The defense also did try to argue against the DNA evidence under Tricia Piccaccio's fingernails, trying to say that it got there from casual contact, but the prosecution was able to refute this. They actually had the expert who conducted the analysis of the DNA under Tricia's fingernails, and they had him testify on the stand at this trial, and he testified that this DNA under the fingernails was a mixture of 50-50 Tricia's DNA and Michael's DNA. And this indicates that there was extensive contact between the two of them, so not just casual passing contact like the defense was trying to say. Now, in Michelle's case, his defense obviously was not able to argue against the DNA found there, so they weren't able to argue that he didn't attack her. So instead what they did is they tried to argue that he was insane at the time of that attack. They even brought in medical experts who claimed that he had been diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder. So in total, this trial lasted for 3 months, and there were 79 witnesses that testified, which Michael was not one of them. Michael did not testify, which I think for obvious reasons. This guy is I don't think he would help his own case. He's very unpredictable. The jury deliberated for 3.5 days, and then on the 15th of August 2019, they found Michael Gargiulo guilty of the first-degree attempted murder of Michelle Murphy and guilty of the first-degree murder of Ashley Ellerin and Maria Bruno. Under California law at the time, he was also eligible for the death penalty in this case. And on the 16th of July 2021, Michael was sentenced to death in California. It's not quite as simple as him just kind of being sentenced to death, because nobody has actually been put to death in California since 2006. And in 2019, the governor, Gavin Newsom, actually put essentially a temporary hold on the death penalty, and he actually had the last facility that people could be executed at dismantled. Now, despite that kind of temporary hold being lifted by the Supreme Court in 2021, still nobody has been executed in California, so it's very likely that he will never actually be put to death. He was extradited to Illinois in 2024, where he's set to stand trial for the murder of Tricia Piccaccio. From what I could find online, he was last due in court in September of last year, but I couldn't actually find anything about that court hearing. He's now 49 years old, and he's being held in Cook County Jail awaiting trial to face prosecution for the murder of Tricia Piccaccio, the only murder he's yet to be convicted of, that he stands accused of. It has been over 32 years since her death, and her family have never given up in trying to get justice for her. Despite being glad about, the outcome of the trial in California, they still want to see justice for their daughter, and they're still waiting for their own day in court, which hopefully will come sooner rather than later. Her mother Diane said after the California trial, quote, "It's always painful. It will always be. I just tell people it's something that I have to live with now and deal with now and try to cope with for the rest of my life. She helped these other girls. She always liked to help people, and I just want to get justice done because that's what my daughter deserves." I cannot even fathom the fact that they have been waiting 32 years for justice for their daughter. And what I cannot fathom even more is the fact that they found the DNA under her fingernails in 2003. So over 20 years ago, they definitively had DNA that linked him to this case, and yet he still has not been prosecuted for her murder. Hopefully he will be tried and convicted of that murder sooner rather than later, and I'll definitely keep you guys updated on how that goes, when the trial takes place, and when we hear an outcome on that. Some people also think that Michael could be responsible for, and he probably is responsible for many more murders than he has actually been convicted of and is suspected of, and some people think that he could be guilty of murdering at least 10 women. According to Mark Lillenfield, Michael apparently provided the police with this cryptic message in which he referenced actually murdering 10 different women that he had come across during his time as a repairman. But that's everything for this case. That's it from me today. I would love to hear your thoughts on this one for sure, because I just think there's no way he's not guilty of more murders, or at the very least, more crimes against women. It has been 32 years since the murder of Tricia Picaccio, and I really fail to believe that he only murdered 2 other women in that time and attempted to murder a 3rd. I just think there's no way that he was not committing more crimes during that time. There's no way, right? But let me know what you guys think. Let me know your thoughts on this case, and I'll definitely keep you updated on what happens with the trial in Illinois for Tricia Picaccio's murder. But that's all from me today, guys. That's all for this case. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week, a wonderful rest of your day, and hopefully I will see you in my next video. Bye, guys.